Watch enthusiasts are strange people, or maybe interesting and unique people. While on one end, they are typically purists and perfectionists. That is, the smallest of the details on the dial, the case dimension, the text and the color of the font can many times make the watch for them a dream watch or a nightmare. On the other, they like to see a watch in its minimalistic and simplistic form. And then sometimes, while they still want to keep it subtle and understated, they seek and desire a touch of color in the watch, a smallest text in the dial, or maybe the smallest dial hand to have a color that, while may not even be noticeable for a normal person, will change the value and the desirability of the watch to 2 to 3 times the value of standard model. It's amazing that when you go into that watch enthusiast state of mind, when you look at your watch, you don't know or see what time or date it is. Rather, all you see is that touch of color in the dial. That is everything to please your eyes and make your day. It's those little details in life, and especially in watches, that make the watch world probably one of the most interesting spaces for those who care, and weird spaces for those who don't. Rolex GMT Master 2 in Pepsi configuration is one of those watches that have always remained very sought after in the collector's world since its first release in 1959, and this is primarily because it always maintained its core attributes of Rolex GMT Master, but then offered that touch of blue and red accents, which have always remained very popular and sought after in the collector's world. While there is Batman in the current Rolex line, when you consider the history, there is no comparison between the two, with Batman being a release from 7 years ago and the Pepsi a watch from over 52 years ago. The Pepsi in its current configuration is basically the first ever GMT Pepsi offered in ceramic bezel, that is, from 1959 until 2007. It was always offered with an aluminum bezel. As much as there has always been a charm and unique looks of aluminum bezel, the only issue was that it used to lose its color and also the shape as it aged, due to aluminum being a soft metal. This is not the case with the latest Pepsi on ceramic bezel. That will virtually never lose its color from the bezel, and then also the bezel is entirely scratch resistant. The Rolex Pepsi comes with glossy black dial, which for all intents and purposes is the same dial texture and color as we see in the Rolex Submariner. The hour markers, the dial hands, the Rolex logo and also the lume in the GMT Master are very similar to what we see in the Rolex Submariner. But when you look at it as a full watch, it is such a different watch that you can have both the GMT and the Submariner in your collection, and they will offer completely different looks and experience. This is primarily due to the bezel that is completely different in the GMT and changes the looks entirely. Also, as this is the GMT watch, there is a 4th hand in the dial for the GMT time, which also comes in red. I will compare this GMT with the Submariner 41 next week on my channel. So if you're confused between the two or want to know the differences beyond the obvious, stay tuned. As the GMT Master continues to remain a 40mm watch, it is worth measuring it by a caliber and breaking it down into its elemental dimensions to help understand its true size. Measuring the size of the case on the outer extremity of the bezel, it is 40.3mm. So while Rolex market it as a 40mm watch, the face of the watch is slightly bigger than that. Measuring the size of the crystal to get the picture of the size of the dial, it is 29.8mm. So while it is a 1mm smaller watch than the Submariner 41, the dial size is the same. How the watch wears on the wrist is determined from its lug-to-lug height, which in this case is 47.7mm. So you would need a wrist that is wider than 48mm to pull it off. the watch comes with a 20mm bracelet at the case, which tapers down beautifully to only 15.4mm. The width at the clasp is 17.6mm. The watch size to 6.5 inches wrist weighs at 141 grams, so it's not really as such a heavy watch either. Under the macro, the hour hand comes with a decent level of finish. There's no multiple facets or beveling on the dial hands, but even under the macro, you can see that the edges are smooth and there's no burrs or high spots, which is indeed impressive. The minute hand comes with a similar finish and there's all polished surface on offer, with the quality that does showcase attention to detail and craftsmanship. The seconds hand, its surface finish and the execution of the joint are all exceptionally executed, with no defects or quality issues on the side. The paint for the GMT has always been one area where we have typically seen very rough edges, but even that is not a problem with this all new GMT. I'm not sure if I've got a very good example in this piece, but looking at it, it does appear that Rolex have listened and improved on the quality even at macro level. The text is crisp and sharp, with all the lettering properly spaced and printed sharply. Similar is the case with the text for Rolex and the crown over it, and there's no flaw or lower workmanship on display. The hour markers have no beveling or faceting, and the surface finish is just average. It's not too bad as such, but it's also not mind-boggling either. Yet it is consistent with the finish I have previously and always seen in a Rolex. Putting the watch in the dark, we have a beautiful blue lume on display. As this is a GMT watch, you can see that the GMT arrow from the fourth hand is also lumed, but since the bezel is completely blind in the dark, the GMT function is virtually useless. This is little disappointing, as with every new release, Rolex simply doesn't seem to be thinking of offering a lumed GMT bezel as yet. I left the watch in the dark for another 5 minutes, and while it is still legible, I can see some inconsistency, especially if you check the hour hand and the duller lume it has just under the Mercedes logo. On the wrist, the Rolex GMT Master Pepsi wears like an absolute Rolex dream. It is indeed one of the most sought after Rolex watches, and when you see how beautifully it wears on the wrist, you can see why it's so popular. The looks from that touch of blue and the red do make this model not just very interesting, but also very beautiful. My wrist size is 6.5 inches and the wristband is 55mm. The watch lug to lug is 47.7mm, so you can see that it doesn't flare out of my wrist and sits in the center. But since its lug to lug is also not too small, it does not look small either. If anything, it looks and wears more like a 41 or a 42mm watch, and I will compare its wearability in my video where I'm comparing it with the Submariner 41. The case thickness of the watch is 12mm, so being a sports and a professional watch, it does not look or feel thick on the wrist. It's not a thin watch either, rather it offers the right amount of chunkiness and substance on the wrist. And while it is at heart a professional watch, thanks to the polished center links and the bracelet, it can easily be dressed up and used for formal occasions. The case contours to the wrist, and you can see that there is not much space between the lugs and my wrist, which is always a desired attribute. The way the Oyster bracelet marries with the case and the watch looks is simply spectacular. The watch comes with the clasp with a polished center area to align with the polished center links on the bracelet. The clasp is Oyster lock safety clasp with flip lock, and then there's a 5mm extension link system to allow for slight length adjustment flexibility. There's then further micro holes to allow fine tuning of the bracelet length for that perfect fit on the wrist. Rolex GMT Master Pepsi is a watch with a history of over 50 years and then a long legacy that makes it an undefeated competitor with basically any other watch produced by Rolex. This particular configuration with Oyster bracelet was previously only offered in white gold, so it is clear that this is an up-spec or a more premium configuration on the GMT models. Rolex later offered the Pepsi configuration with a Jubilee bracelet in steel. And this time, we have for the first time the Rolex Pepsi with ceramic bezel and an Oyster bracelet in the flesh of steel. It has all the bells and whistles to make it a perfect daily, like 100 meters of water resistance, 5mm extension link, Oyster bracelet, and then a ceramic bezel to take day-to-day hits. And then it has all the attributes to make it a perfectly formal watch with those shiny and polished surfaces. The polished surfaces from the case and the bracelet also complement perfectly with the shiny surface on the ceramic bezel and make it a very balanced watch. While the polished center links do get scratched easily on a day-to-day use, if you avoid wearing a beautiful watch like this in a fear of scratching it, mark my words, the joy you are missing is worth far more than the scratches you are saving.